Hey there, my Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Jenna Kelly, and I hope this conversation finds you well and feeling secure wherever you are listening today. As always, I'm super excited to share this next conversation with you, where I sit down with LC Coppola. She goes by LC, and it's such an honor to be able to help shed more light and awareness on the experience of an adoptee. And so that's what she's going to be speaking about today, her own experience as an adoptee and the way that's continued to impact her throughout the lifespan. So she talks about her own healing journey and the work that she also does as a therapist in helping other adult adoptees, and in her journey, especially, and how this can sometimes be a common theme for other adult adoptees with addiction. So let me just tell you a little bit more about her formally. She's a writer, a licensed mental health counselor, as well as the creator and program director of the Voices Unheard Storytelling Program for adult adoptees through the Boston Post-Adoption Resources. She typically writes on themes related to trauma, adoption, and addiction. She's an expert in the field of relinquishment trauma. She has been a guest speaker on several other podcasts and has been published in Severance Magazine, The Fix, and in Adoptee Voices. In 2022, she authored the workbook Voices Unheard, a reflective journal for adult adoptees. And in addition, she facilitates trainings both nationally and internationally for organizations and parents of adult adoptees on topics such as adoptees with addiction and working with adult adoptees one-on-one. And we're going to link ways to stay in touch with her and find out more about her book and all of the great resources she's going to talk about in this interview. And one of the things we talk about is the need for more training for professionals. So she's a great resource if you are needing more training as well. And she just shares her story so vulnerably. So I do want to give a disclaimer that there is reference to sexual trauma in this interview. So take good care of yourself if you need to as listening, and also just being aware for little ears that may be nearby. And I hope that you're able to learn as much as I did from continuing to bring more attention to the topic of the experience of the adoptee. Hello, LC. Welcome to the Attachment Theory in Action podcast. I am truly delighted to be joining you in conversation today.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes, I'm so grateful that you reached out after hearing my interview with the authors of the book Adoption Unfiltered, Sarah, Kelsey, and Lori. That was truly one of the most meaningful interviews that I've done yet as a host. And so I'm really excited that we're going to continue to bring more awareness into the experience of adoptees, and especially how that relates to attachment and attachment loss. So with that, I would love to invite more of you into our conversation, and I would like to invite you to please share an attachment memory that feels important to you and to your work.
All right. I was I was thinking I have a more positive one and one that feels more painful, but so is that okay to share both of these?
Of course, yes.
Okay. So the more painful one is my first memory, which is when I don't know how old I was, probably like around a year, maybe two. I would break my crib at night. Like I would be jumping up and down so hard that the bottom of my crib would always fall out. And I have this memory. It's kind of like it's a body memory, but I remember the wetness of my skin during it and my heart beating really fast. And it would happen when my father would leave the room. He would put me in bed. This is my adoptive father. And then he would leave the room, and I would, now it's taken a long time to understand more about what that was, but I think I was he's gone. My body was he's gone forever. I'm completely alone. And then a more positive memory is that sometimes they would let me sleep in the bed with them when that was happening a lot. We also were a camping family. So, and I don't know why this happens, but I feel like a lot of campgrounds have seasonal sections, and a lot of those seasonal sections, for some reason, have families with adopted children. we used to spend summers at different campgrounds, and one campground we'd be at for 7 years every summer, 3 months of the summer. My mom was a teacher. And then another one we'd be there for 20 years. And each place, it was like a lot of our neighbors were like also adopted kids. But just being in that small trailer with my family, I don't know, there was something about that always brings me like this feeling of comfort, just like a small space with the people you love. So that was kind of more positive one.
Yeah, I can feel my own body responding to that and feeling both that contraction when you shared, the crib memory and that stress and that fear of loss for you, and then also more of that warm and tingly sensation with the memories of love and closeness. And I imagine that's such a common experience, is just that paradox of emotions
Yes.
that adoptees experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That is part of the problem, is the not accepting the that it's yes and also, like it's grief and it's love. It's like joy and pain. It's both things often happening.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot more emphasis on the joy and what we want it to look like and feel like. And I know we'll get more into that too. But I would love for our listeners to continue to take us on your journey and share more with whatever you're comfortable sharing about your own adoption story.
Sure. Well, I can tell you I was adopted at 1 month old from a foster home. I was adopted through the Department of Children and Family, so it wasn't a private adoption, and that's kind of rare for an infant. I actually don't know, any infants that were healthy that were adopted through the Department of Children and Family, other than myself. But so that was a little bit like I didn't understand the difference between private adoption and DCF until I was like a teenager. I have two brothers who were also adopted. My older brother was 5 when I came in. He had been adopted at 3.5 through the Department of Children and Family. And then my younger brother came when I was 8 and he was 7. And he was also through DCF. My parents, my adoptive parents, they had, this love to help kids. And we had kind of a really small little cottage like house. And we always had, a lot of animals, a lot of kids. And we also were an emergency foster home for the state. So we didn't have kids being fostered a lot, but there were times where we would have kids that needed it like a crisis emergency home to go to. And so I imagine that was pretty hard for my brothers and me to witness as kids, other kids coming in and out. My birth mother, I didn't really know much about her. I always knew I was adopted. My parents ran the New Hampshire Open Door Society, which was kind of a like support group for adoptive parents. And a lot of our like the people that we hung out with, almost all of the kids that I knew growing up were adopted until I got into like an elementary school. So I didn't really know that there was a difference. And yeah, so then, yeah, that was difficult in elementary school when I realized, oh, like what sex is, and then like, oh, people that look like they're other people. I didn't really understand. I knew that there was a birth mother out there, but it wasn't like really talked about. It wasn't like I do feel like I could have asked the questions, but I don't feel like the questions were being asked. It was more it was kind of on me to bring it up. And when I was 19, I remember my mom and I believe we were watching Unsolved Mysteries on TV. And I was like, there was like a reunion on the show. And I was like, okay, I will ask in this moment, like, do you know who she was. And she told me, like, so, I feel like it was a little casual, but she said that she was a woman who, she told me her name, and she told me that my name was originally Libby, and they changed it, which didn't hit me hard in the moment then, but now I'm just like, oh my God, it's all I had from her.
Mm.
And then she told me that my birth mother had been institutionalized for much of her adult life with mental illness. And I learned that my parents had learned that she had been assaulted in the institution, and I was conceived from someone raping her. So that was a lot to get in that one night.
Yeah. How old were you when you asked your adopted mom about that?
19.
19.
Until then, she was really a mystery. She was really, someday maybe, I would look out the window and do the whole Fievel with the American Tail somewhere out there thing. That really hit me, that whole, and I would kind of, I would picture her, I would picture what she looked like, and I would almost like, had this like spiritual connection with her, like she's out there somewhere, but I never had asked about details or anything like that. Meanwhile, my older brother was doing all this really controversial therapy. You may have heard of this therapy that was outlawed called holding therapy or
Mm-hmm.
rage therapy. And he was having a lot of issues when he was, 12, 13, these diagnoses, reactive attachment. Um, and he ended up meeting his birth mother at 12. And no one was talking to me about any of this stuff. I just knew that he was really not, that he was really struggling. But I was, seeing this stuff happen in the home. And my parents really were trying to do the best they could, but they just, um, it was a loving home, but it was very authoritative. So I think they were directed to a more authoritative kind of treatment. And back then it was actually like becoming popular at the time. So the holding therapy, if people don't know what that is, it's the child is held down, physically restrained, until they're supposed to reach catharsis through like having a welling up of emotions that are released. And then because of that, move through their pain.
Yeah, it sounds like your adoptive parents, as most adoptive parents, are very well intentioned, but misguided.
Mhm.
The resources that are out there aren't really aligned with the true needs of you as an adoptee and your siblings as adoptees. And I just find it so interesting that you were watching a show called Unsolved Mysteries when you finally asked your adoptive mom that, like trying to really solve your own mystery because there are so many pieces of information that you hadn't been told. And again, maybe well intentioned, like wait till you ask, or I want to protect my adoptive children. And then there you are at 19 getting this whole just, you know, pieces of information that were like, wow, and now this staring out the window to the Fievel song is something a lot different than maybe you were expecting, and what that must have been like for you. So I guess that's my next question. What was that like for you to know more about your birth mom and to know that the way you were conceived was a result of a very traumatic experience for your birth mom?
That was really hard. I mean, that was around the time that I started, well, more heavily drinking. And I had had my own experiences similar to what happened to her happened to me around the same time. So I could feel, I felt almost connected to her in that way. Like I knew what she had been through. And it was, it was definitely like, it was like a dark cloud, just like right over my shoulder all the time. And this mystery of who was this person? What happened, and did anyone know? And just so many questions, and then I did start my adoptive mother, connected us. She really fought for me to have a relationship with my birth mother. So she contacted the state and was able to make that happen. My birth mother had moved out of the institution and was living in a supported apartment. When deinstitutionalization happened, it actually worked really well for her. So she was living near her, psychiatrist and groups and stuff, but on her own. And we wrote letters for about 10 years before I actually met her in person. So that was, I was told by a caseworker who snuck out a report, which I'm so grateful for. And I don't know who the caseworker was, but that I really shouldn't bring up what had happened to her because she was still very traumatized by it, but that she was very very loving person, and that she did feel really connected to me. So I never ever felt any shame from her, which I thought I would feel. I think adoptees born from violence, part of them might think they can't even look at me. I will always be a reminder of this thing that happened. And I don't know in every case, what that's like, but something really healing for me was that she didn't seem to connect me to that. And we wrote letters for 10 years. A lot of her letters were a little bit like the same kind of things like what she did during the day. And sometimes I couldn't read them because they were really messy, and I would highlight things and have my mother, my adopted mother, read them with me to try to figure out what she was trying to say. And I think that was kind of part of what kept me from meeting her in person for so long, because I had other mental illness with my brothers, both of my brothers, and I didn't have the energy to, I just knew that I would want to help her, and I didn't have the space at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But then I got sober when I was 29, and I met her. So that was a good meeting. Do you want me to tell you about
Sure.
that?
Yeah. Sure. Share more about that.
So I think I was a year or two sober. So I was, I had been thinking about meeting her for a long time. I think my expectations were in a good place. They were very low. I didn't think that we had written for a really long time. At that point, her family finally, they knew that I existed. And yes, she lived in a psychiatric nursing home at the time. So I could tell with her writing that things were getting a little bit, she was getting a little sicker because she had Parkinson's from all the medications. So a really good friend of mine went, and we went on her birthday, and her twin brother was there on her birthday. So I didn't know that. She found out I was coming that week. So the nurses were all excited. And yeah, and then I walked in, kind of dissociated from my body. I don't really have a lot of feelings about the moment because I was just not there. But she was in a hospital bed, and she was really happy to see me, and she had some tears rolling down her face, but her face was pretty flat, again, I think from the medication. And then we went into one of the little guest rooms and the milieu, I guess, and birthday cake, and exchanged some presents. And she just kind of looked at me a lot. There wasn't a lot of talking. She just looked at me a lot and just held my hand. And at one point when it was just her and I, she went into the story of what had happened to her in the hallway. She kind of described it, and was probably, I believe she was disassociated herself when she was doing this. She was kind of looking off, and she said, "You're the best thing that came from the worst thing."
Oh, wow.
And I know that's it's it was hard to, I had to bring her back. And but that's, something I have in common with her, I feel, is that even with the dark things, I'm always able to find like something that's a kernel of good, or like, you know, something like a silver lining, even from the worst things. It's not that I think that things should have happened, but she and I feel like have that personality trait in common. So it was a strange experience, but I actually like felt more connected to her because of it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing more about your journey. And I think I heard you talk or read you. So you only got the one meeting with her, right?
Yeah, she passed away about a month after that.
Yeah, I'm so sorry for your loss. I think the journey that you described is so real and it's so different than what we see in the media where the fantasy,
Mm.
which it makes sense as a child, you're the feifel and somewhere out there and we idealize it,
Mhm.
and the fantasy versus the reality of how complex and nuanced and how much loss and trauma and beauty are held in these stories, in these journeys. And what you just shared really brings that to life. So thank you
Mm.
for your openness and willingness to share that.
Yeah. Thanks.
So what is your story? How has that informed your understanding of attachment and attachment loss?
Yeah. I mean, it's really like my understanding grows as time goes on. There are things that I have understood in the past 5 years. I've been through a divorce that have like, I didn't understand before. There's parts, coming out of the fog, that idea of coming out of the fog or coming into a deeper state of consciousness or understanding about the loss of adoption. There were times in my life where I was like, I'm completely out of the fog. I totally like, there's no more to understand. And then it will happen and something new will happen. My friend that I brought to meet my birth mother, she ended up having a baby a few years after that. And just, I had never been around a pregnant person for that length of time. And I had never, understood the connection that a mother really has to their baby and the baby has to the mother when it's in the womb. And I was there in the hospital, like right after the baby was born, and seeing that connection. And so that really got me out even more, got me out of the fog even more. But there was just so much, even in the stories of my brothers, and like the unacknowledgement for all three of us about the traumas we had gone through. And like you had mentioned, it's not intentional. My parents were doing the best they could. And a lot of, it's sometimes there is abuse in adopted families for sure. I mean, but in our family, there was some really tough stuff, some real, my father had a short fuse. My it was like love and it was scary at the same time. But I do believe they were doing the best they could with what they had with their histories and what they had with the tools. And but the empathic approach of like understanding and like letting things be complex and asking questions, and that didn't happen very often. um I remember once at the campground, there was a baby bird that had fallen out of the nest, and I had picked it up with my hands. And I remember my mother came up and said, if you touch it, the mother won't come back, you
Mm.
know? And I was like 7 or something like that. And I remember in my mind going, well, she touched me. Like, is it the same for humans? Like, and if my mother had been more educated about relinquishment and adoption loss, like she could have used that opportunity to like, talk more about how that must have felt for me to hear that. And how
Mhm.
was I thinking about my birth mother after hearing that? But I do think the idea is that if the baby is adopted from birth, that it's more of a clean slate. I think we're starting to change that idea, but it's still kind of the narrative, because people they want to, it's one of your questions I saw was like, why is it not acknowledged? And I think it's too difficult. I think there's something about, we call it adoption, but it's also relinquishment. It's relinquishment from your entire medical, ancestral, genetic history, often from your racial history. And, your first experience is like of trust is not, you don't get that first experience if it's from birth. Your first experience is people will leave, everything I know can change at a moment. And the person that I am connected to in my heart, with my scent, with the sound, everything can just leave in a moment. And I think it's like too big for people to understand. So we just want to put something like a ribbon on it or whatever.
Yeah, makes the us as adults feel better. And then we lose such an important piece of the complexity that you've just shared so much in your story. And when we think about it from an attachment perspective, like that baby bird moment, like you said, if your adoptive mom had more support and resources about how to talk about this, which we hope that there's more of that out there now, but we know there's still more work to be done, that in terms of your own attachment identity, to have more of that information, like you said, what that must have been like for you at 7 or 8 years old, and now trying to do that work as an adult with that memory, and it's ongoing. I hear that from you, that this path is really developmental, and just when you think you've done all the work and you're out of that fog, then your baby has, or your friend has a baby. So it's developmental, and yet we also have this critical time when children are living that we can do so much to support their adoptive parents, the birth parents, and the children. And so I definitely want us to talk about how we can do a better job with that. And I know you've learned a lot about that. What else have you learned from the adoptee experience? Because I know you've also worked with a lot of adult adoptees, especially, and you've written this amazing book, Voices Unheard, Reflective Journal for Adult Adoptees, that identifies a lot of themes and things that adult adoptees may struggle with. So what have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, it's working with adult adoptees, which is, I only work with adult adoptees. I've probably worked with a few teenagers over the years, but I work with adult adoptees, and I also work with parents of adult adoptees. And I used to work in addiction recovery, where like so many of my clients were adopted. And before I moved into working primarily and only with adoptees, but it was always kind of the same themes come up. The connection that I believe every adoptee struggles with. I've never met a chill, relaxed adoptee. Like it's like there's a hypervigilance. It's like our bodies have a stress response system that has maladapted because of either, being removed from a really abusive, neglectful situation in the beginning of our life, or not having that time with the birth mother, and the first experience being, stressful and fearful. And then the stress response system developing from that very early experience, which Bruce Perry has so much research on the brain, and how, we know that we study toxic stress and its impact just by looking at removing rats from their mothers, baby rats from their mothers. And we know that with dogs, it's the same thing. You can't remove them too quickly. But it's not just those animals. We have plenty of information now about human babies. And so, yeah, I think that my, can you say the question again?
Sure. Yeah. What, the themes that adult adoptees may struggle with.
So, yeah, I think that that stress and that issues with trust, combined with that kind of hypervigilance, it can look like a lot of things, and it might also be these things technically, but we often will get in a, I'll see a client and they'll come with a bunch of diagnoses, like they have, I had reactive attachment as a kid, or I have ADHD. That's a huge one. It's like so many of our clients have ADHD, OCD, and they may have those symptoms for sure, but they don't come in saying, I have relational trauma, or I have a, PTSD, or stress, stress unspecified trauma disorder, which is what really has happened. And the symptoms from the other things stem from that. Even addiction, it's not just alcoholism. It's not in a, that's not something that just comes separate. There's a solution in the alcohol and drug use, So yeah, I think that we see a lot of issues with addiction. We see a lot of issues with avoidance in relationships, or like real anxiety in relationships, but it comes from the same place of like intense fear around loss and trust. Most of the adoptees I talk to, who are more on the anxious side of the attachment, I guess, are always thinking about losing people through death or breakup, divorce. I don't know an adoptee who's married that doesn't, in the back of their head, always have an out plan, a divorce plan for when things might happen.
Mm.
And it's kind of strange because in some way, you just kind of know that you will lose everyone. I mean, I've lost both of my adoptive parents, as an younger adult, and it's helped me really grasp life and like see the beauty in life, and cherish the relationships I have, because I was primed to know that loss is so like clearly going to happen. So it's almost made it easier in that way, but I don't think it always makes it easier. I think for a long time I was going around clenched, terrified. When's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? In all my, romantic relationships, when's it going to happen? Yeah, so that's a lot of what we're seeing. Anger as people start to come out of the fog or get more, awareness of how relinquishment has impacted them, because it hasn't been talked about. And society, it's like this disenfranchised grief where society really wants to redirect you from speaking about it negatively. Like, I cannot tell you how many, it's like a regular part of adoptees' lives to be redirected from saying anything painful about adoption. It's like when you're at a, funeral and people are like, he's in a better place. It's like that all the time. It's hard for people to sit in that.
Yeah, I remember talking to Sarah Easterly about this just the gaslighting that you experience as adoptee, because it's like everyone around you is like, what do you mean? It's fine. And again, that fantasy of how wonderful you were adopted, and just supposed to experience this joy and gratitude without the acknowledgement of all the loss and trauma that comes with that, inherent to that. And then I think another trauma on top of that is what you were just talking about with, then we'll pathologize this as an individual pathology to this person, this adoptee, of you have ADHD,
Right,
or OCD, or you have an addiction, without looking at the bigger picture, the relational trauma and the reasons why those symptoms are present. Mm-hmm. And you also have a great article, we'll make sure to link, called Drained Brain, where you talked about where you were also diagnosed with ADHD as a child, and the way you make sense of that now versus as a child.
Yeah.
It's a great resource.
Yeah, I mean, I felt a lot of shame around my learning when I was a kid. I was either, and I did not realize this till later, but I was either dissociating in class or super impulsive. And my parents, I don't know why they never got me therapy for the adoption stuff, but they got me lots of testing for the learning disorder stuff. And no one ever talked to me about relational trauma or being adopted. And, on the testing reports, it's always like, that I was very concerned about reassurance, always seeking reassurance, focused on the tester. I like to sit in the back of the class so I could see everyone, not because I was a bad kid, but I think everyone thought I was a bad kid. Yeah, so there was a lot of that. And, I really was like a DNF student up through graduating high school. And then I didn't go to college. I drank and I like became addicted to drugs. And then when I did finally go to college, um, I found that I could concentrate when I was drinking. And I got straight A's my first semester. It was crazy. Which I don't recommend. Like that, like
Just a disclaimer there.
Yeah, just total disclaimer.
Yeah, you were self-medicating and
yeah.
self-regulating, and continuing to, try to do the unsolved mystery part of your life. And I'd love to know more about the book and how the book, I mean, it makes sense why it came out of this, but share more about, because it's not a quick process either. And I think the book is really an example of this, to kind of go slow with this self-discovery and healing and support. So yeah, tell us more about that.
Well, I really wanted to make something that was like far reaching to help people that don't have access to an adoption competent therapist, or like an adoption competent therapist is someone who recognizes relinquishment always comes with trauma and who understands, the issues that adoptees often have. And I feel like they are kind of few and far between. So I wanted to make something that therapists could learn themselves and use with their clients. And I also wanted there to be, a peer guide. So you could, adoptee peers could like create their own groups from it. And there's a group guide in there that shows peer adoptees how to have like 1 hour sessions where it's like, they're doing a prompt, and the prompts are based on the different themes that we often see adoptees struggling with. There's also a lot of prompts around search and reunion, like even thinking about searching. What kind of things do you want to know? How would you feel if you didn't find out these things? There's a lot of prompts around identity, around boundaries, because boundaries is something we struggle with, shame, and addictive kind of compulsive behavior, because that's such a common thread too. So each week has a different prompt, but they're based on, I think there's like 7 different sections. And yeah, a lot of the stuff in there is like parts centered. So thinking of ourselves as different parts instead of just one whole, because we have these motivations that are coming from different parts of us that aren't healed, or some parts of us that are actually wiser. So there's a lot of part stuff in there, and there's a lot of kind of, narrative prompts that kind of challenge the reader to write a story. Write a story about the first time you were told you were lucky and how it felt.
Yeah, and pretty powerful that we can make an assumption that probably most adoptees, if not all, have been fed that narrative of how lucky for you. So I love that this book is a resource that can be used in therapy and in community with other peers, and can go slow and really take the time to look at these different themes. So it's such a gift. And the other thing you mentioned is working with a therapist. And I know you and I talked about this before recording, of just the lack of training and support that is available to therapists, and myself included. I mean, I think about the very first client that I had who was adopted, who was already diagnosed with ADHD, and all of the things that I missed, ironically, I forget how I figured this all out, but I was actually living across the street from her birth mother and didn't
Oh my
know it
God.
until later, and saw that her birth mother was also, an alcoholic, and there was so much trauma, so much loss. And yet we were focused on this ADHD diagnosis and let's do some rewards and consequences and behavior charts. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to tell this client that I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And yet I was doing the best that I could as a very young therapist and with the training that I had. But there's so much more that we need as professionals too. So what does that bring up for you, LC, and where can we get more training and support?
Yeah, I know. And there's like 7 minutes, I guess, of time is devoted in graduate school towards talking about adoption. Um, yeah, training and support. I mean, that's important. I think that even just the journal is a good thing to like educate therapists, but there are more official trainings for therapists. The We do a training. We just did one in Canada at Boston Post Adoption Resources. We do a training for like adult adoptees 101 for like groups of clinicians. I do a training at kind of my private consultation practice called Adoptees and Addiction. There's a case, the Center for, do you know this center? Okay. It's the Center for Adoption Specific Therapy. No, I can't think of the whole thing. Let me find it real quick.
But we can link it later. Yeah. So we
Yeah.
can link that resource.
Yeah, the Center for Adoption Support and Education. They do a great adoption competency training that I believe is free, actually, but it is. I do think it's like, it's like multiple times for several months. It's a little time consuming, but it's, I think, a really great opportunity. But in general, I feel like who really needs the training? I mean, we all need the training, but I think that the adoption agencies really need more thorough training. That would be my dream, is for the adoption agencies to really, really learn about the science of like the stress response system and how relinquishment impacts it, and how to talk to, there's another book that BPAR, Boston Post Adoption Resources, wrote. I have it here. It's called Adoption is a Lifelong Journey. It's a little illustrated book by our executive director, and it's just like little key points that talk about things for how parents want to talk with their kids about adoption. I feel like if adoption agencies all had something like that, yeah, there's a lot, but regulation, learning that for the parents. I don't work a lot with children, but I know that one thing for adoptive parents, to teach adoptive parents, is to how to grieve their own losses before they're adopting, or to, it's an ongoing process, but to recognize the need to grieve the loss of not being able to have their own child or having lost a child. And also learning how to regulate their stress response systems, because you're adopting a baby that has a dysregulated stress response system no matter what. And if you're dysregulated, it's just going to be really problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much we could say about this, but I think that does a great job of just touching along the surface of some great resources and the need for more support and education for the adoptees, adoptive families, the adoptive agencies, and the birth family. We'll link the interview that I did with the authors of Adoption Unfiltered too, because we touch on some of this as well. And that book is another great resource. I'm wondering a little more for you, LC, about this journey that you've talked so beautifully and vulnerably about, and the work that has taken in terms of your own self-discovery and ongoing healing. And then what it's like for you to also hold space for other adult adoptees to do that, and what kind of self-care do you need so that you can really be present to yourself and to others? What is that like for you? And what do you do to take care of yourself?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I mean, I think the first half of my own healing came with recovery from drugs and alcohol because I had to deal with like all the stress stuff. I mean, you know, with drinking for a while it helps, and then it helps, and then it's crappy, and then it's just crappy. And so when I stopped and I got recovery, all that stuff that I was trying to push down came up, like all the fear. I didn't know how to be in a room with people, which is a lot of recovery, is like being in rooms with people who are also trying to recover. And that actually was terrifying. And I didn't speak for like a year in a meeting, but because I had to keep exposing myself to it over and over again, or else I do believe I wouldn't have been able to. At this point, I mean, it's been a really long time, but like it took a few years, but it really helped me be around people. Like the whole process of like addiction recovery, sticking with the peer element and the group element has like, I feel like really healed a lot of my relational trauma. I have friends, I've had the same friends in recovery for 14 years. We're all in each other's lives, and they've seen me at my worst. They accept me unconditionally. I do feel really lucky in that way, but I think that was a big piece of it. And then getting on the correct medication. Stimulants did not help my ADHD. I'm not saying it wouldn't help for other people, but the diagnosis of ADD brought with it a lot of stimulant medications over the years. What helped me was a correct SSRI for my anxiety, and also learning how to ground myself and learning about attachment, like why it feels like the world's going to end if my friend doesn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
Or why breakups have always been like earth-shattering devastation, and understanding more about attachment, and knowing it is, these are feelings that are really, really early feelings. It's like the first memories coming back again. And then just going through life in a healthier place, being able to feel the things because now I'm not using. And then I'm adjusting to it. I'm adjusting to the loss of my parents as I'm sober and using my supports. And also, I'm really into cold plunging. So shout out for that. I don't know. A lot of people look at me like I'm crazy, but I've done a lot of research on that. And like I now live in Maine, so I'm going in the ocean throughout the year. And I feel like there's something to it. There's an adoptee, Wallace J. Nichols, who wrote a book called Blue Mind. And it's all about the science of water and being near, in, or around water, and how it helps regulate your stress system. I have found it has been very helpful. So just like little tools along the way to help me ground myself. I draw a lot.
Yeah, beautiful artwork behind you. So if our listeners want to also check this interview out on YouTube, that was the first thing I noticed was the beautiful artwork that I think you did most of those paintings you were saying, and that's been really healing for you too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then the writing. I have to mention that. Sorry. The writing that I wrote a memoir, and just going through the process of like my voice and to write a memoir, you really have to learn your voice, like who you are, how you think, what you do. You have to learn about the different parts of yourself. So the process of like writing that memoir and like really having to ask the questions like, what did I want in that situation? What do I need? What did heal? Like, how am I now? How is it different from how I was then? Just that whole, you're writing it in your voice, and it just brings you closer to yourself in a way that adoptees really just struggle with identity so much, that I think that I use that a lot with clients in sessions. Is we'll do some kind of short memoir essays, and I feel like I don't know, I think there's something to it. It's like a journey towards like more identity.
Yeah, it sounds very powerful. All of these modalities speak to the power of the work that you have to do internally so that you can also show up and help others do work. And they may find other things that really resonate for them. But that it's so important that all of us are continuing to do our own work, especially when we're helping professionals, because so much is going to come up along their journeys as we're helping them too.
I think adoptees do well with, and Nancy Verrier talks about this in her book. I have one of her books right here, Coming Home to Self. It's, she wrote The Primal Wound, but this one is the newer one. Anyway, she talks about, blank slate therapists, or not blank slate, blank therapists, like more like psychoanalytic, not giving anything of yourself when working with an adoptee, and how that doesn't really work. And I've experienced that too, where I've had therapists that everything is just reflected back to me. It doesn't feel like I know them. And because it doesn't feel like I know them at all, it doesn't feel like I trust them. Like I really want to know what they're thinking. And I know that that's like, that's tough to moderate and use disclosure wisely as a therapist. But I do think that a therapist that is able to, disclose in a way that's beneficial is really helpful for adoptees, and create that secure relationship if it's long-term therapy.
That makes sense. If you're already very sensitive to separation loss and you're with somebody who's not real, that's going to feel like more separation. And so I'm sure you've been able to find a way to share yourself and use disclosure in an appropriate way to really connect with other adult adoptees and in your work with them in a really powerful way, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anything else you want us to know about your work? Where can people learn more? I know you mentioned those trainings that I'm like, oh, I wish I would have had this training. Probably still could learn so much from it as today. So yeah, tell us more.
Well, you can check out the Boston Post-Adoption Resources website. I think it's just bpar.org. So bpar.org. I also have an Instagram called More Than Just a Lucky Adoptee. It's just like one, that's my handle. And I'm often posting things on there. I do a video series called Adoptees in 3, where I interview adoptees. It's kind of a new thing. And it's kind of short. It's like a 20-minute, little interviews. Sarah Easterly was on there. And you can find that through my Instagram as well. And yeah, contacting, our intake person, or even me through BPAR. My email address there is lisa@bpar.org.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll be sure to link all of that.
And we definitely love to do trainings for organizations, and we do consultations for parents who want to learn more, like 2 or 3 day consultation sessions. Not the whole 2 or 3 days, but like 2 or 3 days of an hour consultation to, help educate. Yeah.
Yeah, don't do this journey alone. I think that's one powerful takeaway.
Yeah.
Is to end us off, LC, what do you envision for the future of adoption? We talked about the need to do better. How can we do better?
I know this is a tough question, because I am not an idealist. Like I wish that there was no need for adoption. I wish that we had a world where everyone was financially, capable, and that there wasn't like long historical lines of abuse, and people in situations where they are coerced to relinquish their baby, or that the baby has been kidnapped, or there's just so many situations when it's through private adoption where there has been corruption, including like just the selling of babies, and people getting pregnant on purpose to sell babies, or babies just being taken. So I really wish that could all go away, and that's like a really long-term, huge systematic issue that will maybe be chipped away. And like over a really long time period. But I think that the awareness around it is exploding right now, because of social media, and there are a lot of adoptee activists. The book that Sarah just co-wrote, Adoption Unfiltered, really shed some light on this stuff. And but so taking away that we can't, like, I don't think that is like a realistic thing that individually we can do. It's more realistic that adoption agencies and adoptive parents and birth parents and adoptees are educated about, birth parents on like their ongoing grief, and about open adoption, the options for open adoption. I just think that like acknowledgement of the complexities and the loss, and can really help people connect more. It's hard stuff to swallow. A lot of it is chipping through denial. Sometimes I'll work with a family for a while, like a year or two, and then you see the light bulb moment, where they realize saying that they don't see color has been hurting their child their whole, this is not, and then a lot of times they're like overcome with like the guilt and they have to work through that too. But if we could do that in the beginning, that would be so great, like, so that's what I would hope would be different, is that there's like longer, scientifically informed education around what happens when a baby is relinquished.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're doing that work. And even the way you shared your own journey and story today has been very powerful. And like you said, chipping away, I'll join you in that journey. And thank you so much for joining me in this very powerful, enlightening conversation today. And I wish you all the best on your continued journey and recovery.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes, it was truly my honor. Thank you. Take good care, Elsie.
Okay.
Bye.